Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
So thank you very much. We do have Roy Wolford back again from last month. Roy? I want to remind all of you that immediately following the lecture, you must stay for the unveiling of the B-2 memorabilia exhibit. And Jerry McCulley, who's standing in the back with the black shirt, will come forward right after Bill's presentation, say a few words, and then we'll go over and unveil the exhibit. Now, although we have many interesting artifacts and documents pertaining to the design and construction of the B-2 aircraft, it is a special privilege to have an experienced and accomplished operator of this exotic aircraft with us today. Bill Flanagan has consented to join us to tell us about his exciting and interesting experiences and to answer many of the questions which some of us may have about what it's actually like to operate this technological marvel. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Flanagan.
I'm going to start off initially by giving you this presentation. I gave it to the Society of Experimental Test Pilots during the centennial year because they said they wanted some technical papers that reflected the history of aviation compared to what we do today. I was lucky enough to fly the B-2 I flew it for over 10 years, worked for Northrop for about 20 years. Each guy that gets to fly the B-2 gets a Spirit number, and I think they're up to 300 now. I'm Spirit 14. So I was lucky to get in on the ground floor of the airplane. But actually my road to flying it started when I was about 10 years old in 1955. I got interested in airplanes and used to collect airplane bubblegum cards. And one of my favorites was the Northrop RB-49 because I said, that is really a cool looking airplane because it looks different from almost every other airplane. So I was always interested in flying wings. So for the centennial, I decided to put together a presentation basically on all of Northrop's flying wings, the bomber type. It's what people think of as the Northrop flying wings. All of them. And my real purpose in doing it was to clear up some commonly held misconceptions on flying wings. For instance, before we first flew the B-2, the pundits were saying the plane would crash on takeoff because flying wings basically are unsuccessful, don't really work, and all like that. I said, that is not true. But then they said, oh, but you got all the computers doing it. And I said, the computers are necessary to make flying wings fly well. But in reality, the flying wings started before computers. So I said, that's kind of the story I wanted to convey. My paper was chosen. I gave it in Paris, in the same room where Wilbur Wright gave his presentation to the Aero Club of France in 1908 on the success of their experiments. They actually have caricatures, since this is Paris, they have caricatures of all the speakers up on the wall, and there was Wilbur Wright next to Glenn Curtis. So it was really kind of a historic thing, and it really, like I said, it shows how history continues on. What Northrop started back basically around 1930 continued on with the B-2. And the story isn't over yet either, because I'll talk about that at the very end. This is actually the Wright Flyer hanging in the National Air and Space Museum. Basically, the Wright brothers in 1903 discovered the secret of making an airplane fly. And of course, the secret was the way you turn an airplane is you bank it, rather than just using the rudder to try and do a flat turn. That doesn't work. That's what everybody else had tried to do. The Wright brothers were the ones that discovered the way you turn is you bank. But because of their design, everybody said, the way you build an airplane is you have a wing, then you have a separate unit which basically has elevators on it that make the nose of the airplane go up and down, and then you have a rudder which you use basically just to tweak the nose as you turn in a direction. So that's kind of the way an airplane is built. wing here, separate tail unit, and that's the way it goes. But in reality, there's other ways to build airplanes. And actually, the first flying wing was actually in about 1913 or so, the Crawford Dunn airplane. So there is a way to build an airplane that is nothing but a wing, and you have to do some tricks. The Horten brothers in Germany did some experimentation, but most people, when they think of flying wings, think of Jack Northrop. So Jack Northrop, like say Roy talked about Jack Northrop, he was a brilliant structures and aerodynamics engineer. Now, anybody in the engineering business knows structures guys want to have the lightest airplane possible with the strongest structure. So Jack Northrop, in addition to all these wonderful airplanes like the Lockheed Vega and the Alpha and the Gamma, etc., also said the idea is, can we build an airplane that's nothing but a wing? So this was the Avion in 1928-29. So let's get rid of everything except the wings, since the name of the game for an airplane is a wing. So as a sort of risk reduction facility, he built a flying wing with the tail in trail. It was a thick wing, had the pilot, the fuel, what little cargo it could have carried in the thick wing, but it actually had a tail that was just sort of following along behind the wing. So they said whether or not this concept will work. So it did, flew quite successfully. So then the Depression came along, so Northrop had to work for Douglas and all. But again, he started his own company in 1939, and he had not given up. He still remembered, yeah, I can build airplanes like the conventional airplanes to keep the doors open, but I'm still interested in a flying wing. So basically, in 1940, he came up with this airplane. This is what we call today a proof of concept demonstrator. This was the pure flying wing. He says, okay, I think we can build an airplane that does not need a tail at all. So I built this little airplane in order to test that concept. They only built one. 38-foot span, weighed 4,000 pounds, twin engines. The control systems, basically what he did was he had one control surface do the job of both the ailerons to bank and the elevators to make the nose go up and down. He still needed a rudder, though, for directional stability. So what he did was he put clamshells out on the wingtip that opened differentially to create drag. Sort of like if you have a rowboat, usually the rowboat has a rudder in the back, but you can also make the boat turn by like sticking your hand out in the water on one side and creating drag. So you could basically make the nose of the boat change. This was a test bed, and the interesting part was the outer wings, you could change the sweep and you could change the droop of them. You couldn't change them in flight like the 111, but you could change them on the ground because he was testing the different concepts. What really is necessary to make a good flying wing? He discovered that you had to have a swept wing because of the balancing of the forces on the airplane, but it wasn't necessary to have a droop. So that picture shows it in the early days, it had a droop, said don't really need a droop. It had some engine problems. This airplane was really underpowered because it was kind of a concept demonstrator. They tried to do it on the cheap, so they got surplus engines and all. Originally, it could not fly out of ground effect. Now let me explain what ground effect is. Ground effect is the fact that when you're very close to the ground, the downwash off the wing from your lift actually bounces off, so to speak, the ground and creates a cushion of air under you, which is like a free lift. So that's why when you get very close to the ground, you may suddenly feel the airplane, if it's sinking, it may stop sinking. So it's sometimes called the ground cushion, sometimes called ground effect. This airplane was so underpowered, it could not fly out of ground effect. It basically skimmed across, and they used Rogers Dry Lake, which is where Edwards now is, as a test facility, and it would skim across the lake sort of like a boat, because it could not get out further than about 10 feet above the ground. So they said, we need bigger engines. So they put bigger engines in. It was still underpowered. In order to get it from Hawthorne, where it was built, up to Rogers Dry Lake, they had to tow it in the air behind a DC-3. It was really underpowered, even when they put the new engines in it. Nevertheless, they said, okay, it does seem to work. And an illustration of that is given here. That's the N-1 in flight. And as you can see, it doesn't have a computer in it, but it's flying quite well. This is a Pathé newsreel in black and white, so you could see it at the movie theater, showing the airplane up at Rogers Dry Lake, where, like I said, where Edwards now is. The pilots found its handling qualities were pretty acceptable for such a little airplane, etc. There were a few peculiarities to it, and one was that when you approached the stall, you got what you call stick lightning. And basically, when you go to stall an airplane, the pilot should be able to pull back on the stick, the nose comes up, etc. But when you got near the stall with this airplane, you had to push forward on the stick, because if you didn't, it would try to flip over, sort of like this. They actually said, why is that? And they actually consulted with Theodore von Karman, the famous aerodynamicist who was at Caltech in that period. And he says what's probably happening is that because your wing is so thick and your elevons are in the wake of that thick wing, when you reach high angle of attack, there's turbulent flow over the elevons that causes them to float up. So as a result, in order to keep the airplane's nose from pitching up too high, now you have to push on it. It's very undesirable. So they said, the way you can probably fix it, there are a couple of ways of fixing it, put the elevons further aft, that type of thing. But this was just a concept demonstrator, so they said, we're not going to bother to fix it at the time. Yes, we'll fix it in the future. Because they'd run out of time, the newsreel footage you saw there up at Rogers Dry Lake was filmed on December 6th, 1941. So the next day, World War II started. So the N-1 had been proven that it was a concept demonstrator and that flying wings would fly. And its role was actually quite important. Jack Northrop was friends with Hap Arnold, who was chief of the Air Corps, who actually was quite interested in advanced aviation technology. So they basically, as World War II approached, they said England might fall and we may need a longer range bomber than anything we have now. So the Army Air Forces started exploring a longer range aircraft. So Jack Northrop suggested to Arnold a flying wing bomber design. The study contract was awarded in the summer of '41. It was going to have 4 3,000 horsepower engines, contra-rotating pusher props, but they were going to build subscale flying mock-ups as risk reduction. Now, I showed you that picture of the N-1 at the very beginning, and it's bright and restored. The reason is it's in the National Air and Space Museum. I said, how did it get to the National Air and Space Museum? And when I was doing the research for this paper, I found out the reason. This, you might say, was one of the first black aircraft prototypes. After it made its demonstration flights there at Rogers Dry Lake, they put it in a sealed railroad boxcar and took it to Wright Field, where they reassembled it, a Northrop team reassembled it and flew it to demonstrate for the Army Air Force that a flying wing would indeed work. So after they were finished with that, they said, well, we don't really want to ship it back. Its job is over. So Paul Garber, who was head of the Air and Space Museum at the time, asked if the Smithsonian could have it. And they said, yeah, sure, go ahead, take it. So it was actually in storage at Silver Hill. I grew up near Silver Hill, Maryland, and I actually remembered seeing the thing under there. They recently restored it and all like that, so now it's pristine. So that's how the N-1 ended up in the Smithsonian. It was in a box. It was shipped by train from Muroc to Wright Field, and then they took it to Washington. They said, okay, that's good, but it's a leap of faith to go to a giant bomber from this little teeny thing. So they said, we'll do some subscale flying mock-ups as risk reduction. Those are the airplanes we know today as the N-9. The N-9s were basically 1/3 scale flying mock-ups to the B-35. They had 2 engines instead of 4, but they had pusher props. They weighed about 7,000 pounds. They used the elevons for pitch and roll, but they experimented with different types of wingtip devices for yaw control. They weren't completely satisfied with the clamshells opening differentially. So each N-9 originally had a different configuration for wingtip devices. The first one had forward opening clamshell speed brakes. And for a rudder, they had a little scoop that came out under the wingtip to cause differential drag in order to do it. So, you know, it's an example of we want to tinker with it, and it's a rather strange design. The forward opening clamshell things, they painted shark teeth on them because they looked like, you know, jaws coming up on you. In fact, they even jokingly called them the Jap snappers, from what I understand. In reality, it was a terrible idea because it stalled the wingtips very quickly, so they never actually used them in flight. But they used the scoop rudder basically for differential control. The airplane crashed after 22 hours of flight and killed pilot Max Constant. What they were doing was they were doing stall tests at AFCG. The plane crashed, the guy got into a spin, the left spin chute, because in those days they put chutes on the different wingtips to try and arrest a spin. The left spin chute was deployed. The plane, however, was still in a spin at the impact. Bailout was unsuccessful. The canopy was jettisoned, the pilot's lap belt was undone, but he was not able to get out of the airplane. They theorized what had happened was that stick lightning they were talking about pulled the yoke back against his chest and pinned him in the seat. So he was unable to get back. So, okay, stick lightning now became, ooh, that is kind of an important thing. Now, stick lightning, however, does not have any effect in that sense if you have what we call irreversible flight controls. A Piper Cub has reversible flight controls. The stick is connected directly by push rods and cables to your control surfaces. So anything that happens to control surfaces is fed back to you. Nowadays we use hydraulic systems to actually move the control surfaces, because if you have a really big airplane with heavy control surfaces or you're going really fast, you need hydraulic boost in order to move the control surfaces. So that's what we call irreversible flight controls. That was very revolutionary for these days. The N-9M, to the best of our knowledge, is the first airplane that flew in the world that had irreversible flight controls. Like I say, the airplanes look like toys, but they're not. They're engineering test beds. And some of the features they had were extremely sophisticated. The first N-9M had manual flight controls, which is probably what killed Max Constant in the sense he got pinned. The later N-9Ms, because the B-35 was going to be so big you had to have a hydraulic boost. So it was going to have the hydraulic boost, which they did later on. But anyway, they said, we got a problem with the spin. So basically, they went to Langley Field, the NACA, and basically put models of the flying wings in the spin tunnel. My master's thesis at Wright Field happened to be on spins, and I live near Langley down in Virginia, and I've seen the spin tunnels. It's a vertical wind tunnel. The air blows up that way. And basically the way you test it is you throw the model into the airstream like a frisbee. And you have adjusted the control surfaces to reflect what the object of the test is. And actually they have little radio controls so that you can change the flight controls while the thing is spinning around. Really kind of a neat device. It is still there today. We actually tested the B-2 model exactly the same way. They used to joke that the operators had to have talented wrists because they'd say, we want you to throw it in spinning at this rate, for instance. So the guys were very good. They would have been great at Frisbee today and all like that. So anyway, they tested both the N-9, which is the twin prop little one, and the B-35, the big one. They discovered that if you put aft center of gravity on the model, spin entry was much more likely and it was quite violent. Spin recovery characteristics, and this was the weird part. The way you normally get out of a spin is ailerons against the spin and rudder against the spin. For flying wings, it turned out the rudder you had to have backwards to that. You put the rudder into the spin in order to get out of it, which is really odd. And I think the reason for it is because the rudders on a flying wing are closer to the ailerons and they have adverse yaw effect. But anyway, so they said, well, that's really weird. So NACA said, okay, we recommend if you get in a spin with a flying wing to put aileron against and rudder with the spin for recovery. The Northrop engineers said that is so contrary to the way it should be. don't touch the rudder at all. The ailerons themselves will eventually bring you out. So like I said, that was a peculiarity that they had never known about before. But they made, and the spin tunnel tests were done after the initial crash, so it was about 1943. As long as they were doing the tests, they said, what will happen with this thing which looks like a boomerang if we get it reverse English? So in addition to yawing, it is actually pitching. And they discovered the thing would tumble over backwards in the model. So they said if you got an FCG and a high initial pitch rate, because you don't have a long fuselage to damp the motion out, the thing will actually go like that in addition to going like that. So that was just one of those things, since they had some time to kill, they said, okay, we'll try that. The N-9M2, they did away with the Jap Sniper forward opening speed brake, but it flew successfully. It showed increased drag in flight versus what the wind tunnel predicted. And they said, was the wind tunnel messed up? Maybe the little model was too small. So they actually mounted the N-9M inside a wind tunnel, complete with a pilot, by the way, and actually measured the drag while he was, quote, flying the airplane in a wind tunnel. And they discovered, no, the predictions of the drag in the wind tunnel matched what they saw in the air. So the problem was not with the little model in the tunnel. The last two N9s, the N9M-A and B, and the B is the one that's flying at Chino today. They had the flight controls final configuration for the B-35, aft-facing symmetrical clamshell, combined clamshell, rudder and speed brake, hydraulics for the elevons. Now, you could fly the thing manually, but you flipped a switch, and basically when you move the stick, you are actually sending commands to hydraulics to move the control surfaces up and down, which, like I said, that is actually very sophisticated. That's probably the first use of that in the airplane, because the problem is you can't feel the airplane very well. So you have to have artificial feel for the pilot, and usually the way you do that is with springs and bob weights on the control surface. So they actually developed that on the N9Ms, and everybody today uses it. This airplane was actually the first one that did that. Completed the test programs. There were no further aircraft losses, so we ended up with 3 N9Ms, and they were used for flying wing pilot familiarization flight up at Muroc, and over 20 guys flew the airplane. Basically, they said it was sensitive in pitch, and when you did a rudder kick, it would just oscillate back and forth. Okay, this is the N9M on the ground at Muroc. You can see it's a cute little airplane and all like that. This is the only shot of all 3 of them in flight today. They were moving them from North Base to South Base. They were painted yellow on top and blue on the bottom, except for one that was painted the other way around. And the reason for that is if you're taking black and white film of the airplane, you could not tell which way is up. And you will see that in every flying wing photo. It's extremely difficult from a distance to see which way is up. But here's the airplane flying around. Again, no computers, but as you can see, it actually handled pretty well. The Chuck Yeager got to fly it, Bob Hoover, and people really kind of liked it. Said, yeah, it's directionally kind of squirrely, but for a fighter type airplane, that's okay. Now notice when he took off, you notice how he kind of leveled off there. That's because he flew out of ground cushion. So he goes up and all like that, and these airplanes were underpowered too, just like the N-1, not quite as bad. But when he left ground cushion, you notice the plane kind of settles. So that was very noticeable up at Edwards on hot days. When he comes into land, notice the same way. He goes back up again because he's entered the ground cushion, so he's picked up extra lift. So as a result, that was kind of an interesting effect. But they said the airplane was pretty good. In fact, one of the pilot reports said, I'm surprised the thing flew that well. And the pilot who signed that report was Glenn Edwards. So it goes to show that, again, people, they had flown flying wings before and said, oh, once you get used to its odd characteristics, the ground cushion effect was the main one, said it works pretty well. Here comes the XB-35, 1946, and it's basically, I'm going to show some footage in here of the first flight. And for people that watch the 1930s aviation serials in the movies, they tended to use sometimes flying wings. So this kind of reminds me of it. All those propellers flapping around too. This is Hawthorne in 1946. You notice the surrounding neighborhood has changed a bit since then. They always took off toward the west, as Roy said, in case, and we did the same thing on the first flight of the B-2. You fly toward an uninhabited area in case you got to dump it. But sorry, east, beg your pardon, thank you. So you got to dump it. They're coming into Muroc now. You'll just see the P-61 with Roy in it come in the lower right-hand corner momentarily. I will point something out to you. You're coming into the Muroc, and you'll see what looks like a Japanese cruiser sitting out on the lake bed. That is the famous Muroc Maru. To the best of my knowledge, this is the only footage that ever showed that thing. It was a full-size replica of a Japanese cruiser, which they used for strafing and bombing training. I've actually been out on the lake bed at Edwards and found where it used to be. It was a Hollywood prop. And the way I found the location was there are hundreds of nails out there in the lake bed and thousands of machine gun bullets. So that's where it was. But like I say, that footage, when I first time I saw this footage, I said, my God, there's the Muroc Maru, because they tore it down in about 1947. The B-35 flew, it had terrible problems with the props and the shafts. Vibration levels were terrible. 2 B-35s flew. They flew a total of 27 flights in 3 years. They were constantly working on trying to fix the propulsion system problems, not the flying wing itself. So it basically was kind of a failure. But no one really cared. The war was over now, and what had happened toward the end of the war, the jet revolution. So people said, we're not interested in jets or props anymore. We're interested in jets, so it's kind of academic interest. So they built like a total of 14 huge flying wing airframes, which are parked down here at Hawthorne, but a bunch of them never got engines because of the decision. They said, we're not going to put props on them with reciprocating engines. Maybe we'll put turboprops on them. Maybe we'll put jets on them. So basically, a bunch of the airplanes were just sort of kind of parked out there, and if you look at them closely, you see there's no engines in them. So only a total of 5 big flying wings flew, and a 6th one had engines in it, the 3rd B-35, but it never actually flew. They got rid of it before it actually flew. So anyway, the jet revolution is coming up. So we'll make slight changes, and they started in 1944. They decided to make those changes. 8 4,000-pound thrust turbojet engines. That's a total of 32,000 pounds. Remember that figure. They put extra fuel tanks in some of the bomb bays because jets use a lot more gas than props did. They put 4 tails on the airplane. You can see them sticking up and down. That's a way you can tell at a quick glance if it's a B-35 or YB-49. If you see those little tails, it's a YB-49. But basically, it's the same flight control system as the B-35. It's just you ripped out the props and you put in the jets. So here we go for yet another first flight. So if the B-35 looked like a 1930s serial, the YB-49 looked like a spaceship. This is the shot that Roy was talking about the last time. I said, I wonder if he's really lying on the runway. I didn't really think so. I figured that's probably a held down camera. So here's the YB-49. This particular footage. This is the YB-49, a bunch of footage, which I'm sure Roy's familiar with a bunch of it. Some of this, of course, is used in the movie War of the Worlds in the 1950s, the George Powell production, because it looked like a really futuristic airplane, even though in reality this footage was taken in 1947. So that was the YB-49. So said, okay, that is really what people think of today as the flying wing jet bomber. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 urban myths about the YB-49. The high angle of attack behavior, the stability of the flying wings, and how it was as a bombing platform. Because those are the 3 reasons that are usually used for canceling the airplane. Ship 2 was lost in June of '48 with Glenn Edwards and Major Forbes aboard. Forbes Air Force Base in Kansas and Edwards are named after them. Cause was never definitely established. There was no chase aircraft. There were no radio calls. I have the actual flight cards that they were supposed to be doing, and they were doing cruise performance tests followed by stalls. They ended up saying, we can't do the cruise performance test, it's too turbulent at high altitude, so we're going to go down and do approach to stalls. In reality, the big flying wings had not yet been tested by the contractor for stalls. Max Stanley started to do it on the XB-35 and said, if anything goes wrong, there's no way to get out of this airplane. So before we continue with the stall tests, we got to figure out a way how to get out. They didn't have ejection seats or anything like that. They never completed the tests. So the Air Force was doing what we call phase 2 testing, which was supposed to be mainly performance testing, like those cruise tests. But they also do things like, how does the airplane behave? So they basically were doing approaches to stalls, as they called it, in the test cards. When it crashed near California City, up north of Edwards. The outer wings impacted about a mile from the center section, so the airplane had come apart in flight. The wings failed in a symmetrical over G. Now, in order to over G the airplane, you've got to have a lot of speed going. And if you're in a stall or a spin, you have very low speed. You can't over G the airplane. So the fact that the airplane was over G'd meant it was not in a stall or spin. Center section hit flat with little forward motion. An Air Force pilot, General Cardenas, as he now is and all like that, when he was exploring the airplane, he experienced what he described as a tumble, where the airplane went over backwards. And he managed to recover from it, and he said, no one should really stall this. Well, you usually don't stall an airplane that big anyway. In fact, it had already been placarded, no deliberate stalls. So he was kind of stating the obvious. After the loss of ship number 2, Northrop said we had better explore the high angle of attack behavior of this airplane. So Charlie Tucker went up to 30,000 feet and did some stalls. One characteristic of a flying wing, as Roy mentioned, is it picks up speed very rapidly when it's pointed downhill because it's so clean. So he said, I'm going to start at a high altitude. Oh, the approaches to stalls were done at 15,000 feet, according to their test cards, which is only 12,000 feet above the ground in the Antelope Valley. So he said, I'm going to start at 30,000 feet. I'm going to put the gear down to create drag so that when I recover from the stall or spin, I won't basically end up trying to go supersonic pointed straight down. The stalls were okay, except the airplane tended to fall off on the right wing during the stall recovery. You move the center of gravity further aft, and when he reached 30% center of gravity, basically he went to stall and the nose just started to rise. And he basically pushed full forward yoke and the nose still rose. And basically the airplane went up like that. So basically it departed and it fell off to the right. According to the telemetry, or to the recording, he, out of force of habit, he basically hit the rudder pedal to lift the wing, so to speak. Unfortunately, by doing that, he basically went from a stall into a spin. And because remember, they said, don't touch the rudder, but it's really hard not to if you think you're going to be in a spin. And with a flying wing, you need to go the other way. So he realized his error, got in a spin, recovered from it, and now he's pointed downhill. And they said, okay, don't pull more than 2 G's to recover. But he said, we're just picking up speed and the ground is coming up, so I'm going to pull 2.5 G's. And that's probably okay. You won't break the airplane. So he actually recovered at 8,000 feet. So he lost 20-some thousand feet. So I suspect what happened was basically the test they were doing with the Air Force airplane. They probably stalled, entered. I talked to Rush Schley, who was one of the Air Force test pilots. He said, we did not know that the rudder worked backwards from what it should for a normal spin. I got hold of the flight manual that they were using for that period, and I knew the answer. And when I read the spin recovery directions, it was worded in such an odd way that it was not obvious to me. I would have just said in big bold letters, spin recovery, backwards to what you're used to, but it was not worded that way. So he said, we really didn't know that the spin recovery was different. So probably by the time they got it all sorted out, now you're headed downhill, the ground is coming up really fast, so they probably pulled looking at the wreckage, they probably pulled 4 to 5 Gs and pulled the wings off. So that's probably how that happened. YB-49 stability, General Cardenas was quoted as saying it was unstable. He did not say unstable, he said marginal stability. And basically, Jack Northrop, in a talk to the Royal Aeronautical Society in 1947, had pointed that out. He said flying wings have low pitch damping because they don't have a fuselage. They have a phugoid, which is sort of the roller coaster motion that normal airplanes go through. For a normal airplane, the phugoid is like this, with a period of about 1 to 2 minutes. For a flying wing, because of no damping, it's 10 seconds. So it goes like this. And it has very low side force, so if you get in what we call a Dutch roll, it goes like this. And they call it Dutch roll. Picture a Dutch speed skater from behind who's swinging the arms and the tail going like this. That's a Dutch roll. That's why they use that name. It said they had a bad Dutch roll in the YB-49, but they said that's okay with an automatic yaw damper, which was supposed to go on the airplane. That'll take care of that. Ship number 2 had the autopilot. Ship number 1, which is what they conducted most of the rest of the tests with, did not have the autopilot until it was retrofitted in 49. The bombing platform tests, basically they took the YB-49 up and they used a Norden bomb sight, which, by the way, was not as really good as the Air Force would like you believe, but they did bombing tests with it and a B-29. And basically, the YB-49 bombing error was twice what it was of the B-29. Part of the reason was due to the fact that the airplane did not have an autopilot, and basically, the way the Bombardier works with a Norden bomb sight is you're bent over looking down through this telescope at the ground, and you spend a lot of time looking at the ground. And if you're looking through a telescope that's doing a hula dance, so to speak, the Bombardiers found it very hard to set the Norden bomb sight correctly. In addition, they got airsick because looking at the ground doing a hula for a couple of minutes and all like that, they really got airsick. The B-49, because it was a jet bomber, was not planned to use an optical bomb sight. It was supposed to do radar bombing. But because the B-29 they had available had a Norden bomb sight and they wanted to compare the two, they forced the YB-49 to use a bomb sight that it never would have used in real life. In addition, the YB-49 did not have the autopilot, so it couldn't damp out that motion. So they put the autopilot in, and the bombing scores improved noticeably. However, they still were not great. And I talked to Rush Slay, who flew the airplane for those tests and also chased it. And he said sometimes when you drop the bombs would fly along with the airplane for a while. Sometimes they'd go sideways and drop straight out of sight. Sometimes they'd pitch straight down. And all of that changes the ballistics of the bomb so that you really can't hit anything really well. So they had an airflow problem is the best way to describe it. So those are all the things that sort of doomed the YB-49. It was canceled in 49. The B-47 was faster because it had a thin swept wing. The B-35 was intended to do only 300 miles an hour or so, but with jets it could go faster, but the thick wing meant you had drag. And in addition, the B-49 could not carry the 5-foot diameter A-bomb of the era. It had many little small weapons bays. You couldn't put the A-bomb in it. Of course, you couldn't tell anyone that because the A-bomb configuration wasn't released until the 1960s. The RB-49 was proposed as a long-range reconnaissance airplane, had 6 jets, 2 of them were outside, 1 built, was flown in 1950, but they said, hey, these things are too expensive, it's 1949, the budgets are low. The RB-50 was purchased instead, so it went on through the Cold War. And here is the last Northrop Flying Wing, the RB-49, parked out in Ontario, out in a field, because I guess they were flying F-89s in those days, flight test out of there. I gave this talk once, and a guy came up to me. He said, when I was a kid, I used to ride my bicycle out there. I lived in Ontario. We'd slip the hole in the fence, my buddy and I. We'd climb into the RB-49 and play jet pilot. The guards all knew we were there. We'd wave at them and all like that. The airplane was scrapped in 1953. I keep thinking, the Chino Air Museum moved just down the road in the 1970s. If only they just left it parked out there in the dirt, we'd still have an RB-49, but no such luck. So that was the end of Northrop's Flying Wings, or was it? One of the things they talked about, and Roy talked about it, about the flight they flew, they noticed that it did not show up very well on radar. So they said, yeah, okay, well the thing is an early stealth design, so to speak. So it wasn't until the 1970s that stealth became very important, something that doesn't show up on radar. So they said, okay, we'll do it with little airplanes, but how about having a stealth bomber? So there's a competition, Lockheed, Northrop, and all like that. And the Northrop entry basically won. So guess what the Northrop design was? It was the B-2 bomber. And son of a gun, it's a flying wing. And same wingspan as the YB-49, but there are differences. Lots more thrusties, which is nice. And I'll show you the airplane here. Here's the B-2 on its first flight. You notice one thing, the YB-49 had one elevon on each wing. The YB-49, or the B-2 actually has three, so we have a lot more control effectiveness. Nevertheless, the clamshell drag rudders we still have and all like that, but you can see all the elevons we have. We're a higher speed airplane. We have a thinner outer wing than the YB-49 did, and we're designed to fly at low level at high speed as well as high level. 4 18,000-pound thrust turbofans, so that's 72,000. In addition, the YB-49's wing area was about 3,500 feet. Ours is 5,000. This is the first landing. Notice the slight level off there again. That's because of the ground cushion effect. Like I say, that is characteristic of virtually all flying wings when you hit ground cushion effect. With a 172-foot wingspan, your ground cushion is half span. It's up to 80 feet in the air. So, but again, guys get used to it. B-2 test program, just a comparison, 50,000 hours of ground tests for flight controls and all like that. 6 bombers. We flew 5,000 flying hours in 8 years. By coincidence, I ended up flying the very last sortie of that test program. B-35 and B-49, 6 bombers, 400 hours in 5 years. So that shows the differences. B-2 experiences, let me talk about them. Same thing as the B-49. High angle of attack. No deliberate stalls are permitted. We don't just have placards. We basically were a fly-by-wire flight control system, and the computers say, we ain't going to let you do that. I said we ought to have a mild electric shock for even trying it, but they haven't done that. However, in the flight test program, we're the guys that had to set the limits for the angle of attack indicator. So our angle of attack limiter was set very loosely, and we approached the boundaries very gingerly in order to set it for the operational guys. We did a lot of flight tests to validate the limits prior to setting it. We scrupulously planned, and this is a joint Air Force Northrop effort. Before, like Northrop would have it, then the Air Force would have it, then Northrop would have it, then the Air Force would have it. What we do nowadays, it is a joint combined effort, and we all talked to each other, got it done quicker, and got it done, I think, a lot better. There were 2,000 people in the B-2 test force at Edwards, and they got along great, which I understand was not always the case in the 1940s. So that's, again, a good thing. There was a single, what was that? When I wasn't flying the airplane, I was usually the test director. I was the test director on that particular one. The test pilot was a classmate of mine from test pilot school. He went, what? And the engineers in my headphones were going, terminate, terminate, because something unexpected had happened. So basically what we did was we said, air off. We're not going to go on further on. We landed, we analyzed what had happened. We updated our simulator, we basically practiced again, and then continued on with it. So that's the way we do things nowadays. Stability, we had quadruple redundant flight control systems, 4 computers. So basically, you're telling the computer what you want, you the pilot want, and it tells the control surfaces what to do. So as a result, you can compensate for all the flying wings' natural dynamics insufficiencies. Nevertheless, we found results that were different. You can't see it too well in this picture, but notice the size of the weapons bays. They're huge. You can park a minivan towing a trailer in each one. We have 2 of them. The doors are huge. When you open the doors, it actually affects the 5,000 square foot flying lifting surfaces, because you now have this huge cavity in the bottom, and you can actually feel the effect on the lift distribution of the airplane by those big holes. In addition, when you move the throttles back and forth, you can actually feel the airplane respond to that, because our engines are on the top of the wing, not in the middle of the wing. I'll show some footage of some of the testing we're doing. Now, up at Edwards, we're at 2,500 feet, so if we have to do low-level stuff, we have to go out over the water. We had to do high-speed, low-level, which the YB-49 didn't. This was interesting. This is our fuzzball effect, as we call it. We're not going supersonic. That's condensation effect over the humid ocean. The airplane, basically, what we're doing is we're testing for flutter, that you don't have the wings start vibrating like Galloping Gertie, the Mackinac Narrows Bridge, because airplanes can do that too. So we're testing that. This is an interesting effect of ground effect, and this was an uh-oh. This wasn't the uh-oh, but this is an uh-oh. Watch the B-2 take off here, and watch the control surfaces on the trailing edge. The pilots actually were kind of, whoa, that's kind of interesting. The engineers went berserk when they saw the control surfaces do that. They were doing a short takeoff, and basically the engineers said, put the stick back in your lap and it'll take off by itself. It took off too soon. So that was an indication of the fact that a wing in ground effect behaves differently than a wing that's not in ground effect. Bombing platform, basically we didn't use optical bomb sights, and we had no problems with bombing. Future, flying wing lessons learned. Society of Experimental Test Pilots, you gotta have lessons learned. Ground predictions aren't perfect. Nonlinear areas near the speed of sound and ground effect. Dynamic situations. Large wings are sensitive to small changes. And that is something that the YB-49 folks never learned because they didn't fly the thing enough. But since we were building an operational bomber, we did discover this. So we said, flying wings have some peculiarities, even different than what people think. Prototypes, test beds are a good thing. The N-1 discovered some certain problems with the surface lightning. The N-9M validated the B-35 flight controls configuration. We actually used an airplane that pretended to be a B-2, even though it was a conventional airplane, before we first flew the B-2. The C-130 avionics testbed flew 600 flights to check out the radar and a bunch of the bombing system computers before the B-2 flew. But Jack Northrop's vision, of course, was not just for a bomber. It was for other uses for flying wing. This is a 1949 promotional film, which basically shows the airliner of the future of the flying wing. I actually really liked that lady's hat. And I thought 1947 was when Kenneth Arnold saw flying saucers near Mount Rainier. So apparently by 49 they decided they could have women's hats that either look like flying saucers or flower pots if you go through this thing. This is the aft-facing blister on the YB-49, which they converted into an observation lounge. Now, banking in an airplane when you're facing backwards is almost guaranteed to get you airsick, I can say that. So I don't think that would have been a great idea. The leading edge flying glass I thought was really pretty neat. And I love the fact that you have enough headroom in this thing so you could leave your hats on. So basically, the B-2 was, you might say, the end result from what Jack Northrop was planning. And you say, oh, well, that's kind of it. And I said, no, that isn't it. This week's Aviation Week talks about the X-48B, which is flying at Dryden right now. It is a 12-foot flying wing airplane that Boeing and NASA are working on. They're flying it subscale right now as an unmanned aerial vehicle, but the idea is for the future to have a flying wing, initially cargo aircraft, since packages don't care about window seats. But eventually the idea is have flying wing type airliners. Because what the B-2 did was it killed all those ideas from the past that said flying wings cannot fly properly. The answer is, oh, yes, they can. And there are a number of benefits to a flying wing, which now the concept has been proven. Who knows, the next generation of aeronautical engineers will be working on civilian uses for flying wings. And this actually is N-9M-B, which is the fourth N-9M, parked in front of Ship 6. It's parked in front of the engine run dock at South Base. It's about 50 yards from where the YB-49 was parked and where the N-9M was originally parked, because they tore down South Base, but then they rebuilt it for a secure facility for the B-2. And I said, that's why we parked that airplane right there, because it said, it's come home. And the graphics guys said, well, we gotta do something with that. Pay attention. I was talking to Roy beforehand when I was researching some of the video for this film. The Northrop audio-visual folks had a VHS tape that was marked Northrop Color Home Movies, and it's actually movies taken by somebody with a home movie camera who was outside the fence at Hawthorne for the B-35 first takeoffs and for the YB-49. It's really quite interesting, just like that 1949 film that shows people dressed differently, et cetera, with a flying wing, and this home movie video actually shows that. And if we get some time later, if anyone wants to look at it, we can do that, because you really kind of need to see it on the laptop, and Cindy is champing at the bit in order to get with the B-2 thing. So I will be happy after we do that to answer questions. I'll be hanging around and all like that. So I really thank you for your attention. And like I said, the whole purpose of this test was of this paper was basically to tell people, you know, you all think flying wings were a failure and it was only with computers were able to do it. Said, nope, it was a process that went over about 50 years and all like that, and all built up to what we have today. And that's the story of engineering. You build on what you had before. Thanks very much for your attention. And I have about 500 hours in the B-2, and before he tries to get away, there's a gentleman who's standing in the back wearing a flight jacket named Bob O'Brien, who was my life support technician for all those years and on the test bed that helped keep me in one piece. And just recently, he was the guy that helped conduct the sled tests on the ejection seat for the B-2. And of course, we got a graphic demonstration at Guam of you better have ejection seats, and it's actually due to a lot of his work that those guys were able to get out when everything turned to hell. So OB's retired like I am, not like that, but I want to thank you for all your work for Northrop for all those years.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we now have a special event, the unveiling of the B-2 exhibit with Jerry McCulley. So if you'd like to proceed to the other wing of the hangar, we'll unveil the exhibit. And thank you very much, Bill. We're going to have you back. All right. Thank you so much for coming.
I'd like to specifically thank Tony Chong, Craig Caston, Kevin Helm, Ian Maddock, and Jesse Lozano, who have cost me a lot of money over the years. So that's it. Enjoy, and I'll be around if anyone wants any questions. We're going to unveil this to the public here. I don't know what one is supposed to say. I guess I now declare this bridge open. And the books I left here last time. Basically, this exhibit spans roughly 1988 through the Kosovo War, although we do have some pieces here from Afghanistan and Iraq. But basically, a lot of it's from the CTF years, and just a fair representation of the entire program, we hope. The signatures were gathered at Northrop approximately 1997-98. And the first person to sign it was Bill Flanagan. This is off of his test ship that he flew, which was AV-4, which was also known as Christine. And I think we should all ask him why it was called Christine, after the Stephen King novel, The Plane That Had a Mind of Its Own. Now, I've heard some stories, but I'd like to hear it from the horse's mouth. The importance of this exhibit from a personal viewpoint is my father worked for Lockheed for 41 years, worked many years in the Skunk Works, and at the end of that period, what he took home from that program you could hold in the palm of your hand. And there was, tens of thousands of people worked on this program, and I'd like to honor them in some way. And that's why we have pictures of folks that worked on this, the signatures. I don't think I need to explain to you what the importance of the aircraft is. Everyone understands that. But that's, from a personal viewpoint, that's why I did this.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.